It's a pleasure to open this afternoon plenary session on global food policy and obesity. And it's an honor to welcome Professor Kelly Brownell, who is professor in psychology and neuroscience. He's the dean of the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University in the United States. So thank you very much for coming in Europe.
Thank you, and thank you for introducing me, and thank you for inviting me to this meeting. I've often thought that the European Congress on Obesity is one of the best meetings in the world because it combines such a nice combination of people working on basic science and on public health and public policy, and that intersection, I think, is very exciting, at least for me. So again, thank you for having me here. Today I'd like to talk about what I think the importance is of connecting the world of obesity research and obesity policy with other aspects of food policy more broadly. And to me, the importance of doing this stems from one problem and one missed opportunity. The problem is that very often policy gets made because some voice gets the attention of policymakers and some policy gets made. Once in a while, the policy ear, the ear of the policymakers is hearing the voices of obesity researchers. Very often it's hearing another set of voices from the world of agriculture, let's say, or from people who work on food insecurity and hunger and malnutrition. And as a consequence, we get policy that doesn't often work in a coordinated way. And the missed opportunity here is the opportunity to have many voices coming together to argue for change, whereas now the obesity field is kind of a voice in isolation. So I'll begin by saying that there's nothing to disclose. And when I first got involved in the obesity field and began looking at drivers of obesity, a number of things came up. These are just examples, but these are obvious things that get paid a lot of attention in our field, including at meetings like this. But there is a whole nother set of issues that are affecting obesity that our field generally doesn't pay much attention to. We're not trained to know what goes on in these fields, and we're not reinforced usually for crossing barriers between fields. But things like agriculture subsidies have a heavy impact on the price of food. The price of food in turn affects levels of obesity. International trade policies are highly influential in what foods are available to people around the world and at what cost. Industrial forms of agriculture make possible certain types of food processing that make certain foods available to people, again at low cost. Food supply chains are extremely interesting part of the picture, and the simple idea that food is a commodity that gets born from industrial forms of agriculture has important impacts on what food people have access to around the world, and these are in turn affecting obesity. Just take meat consumption for an example, and I'll talk more about this later, but with meat consumption comes calories, comes saturated fat, risk for heart disease, cancer, and a number of things. I was speaking to somebody not long ago from the World Bank who told me that China has made a very deliberate trade decision to meet the increasing meat consumption demands in that country. They faced a choice of importing grain, feeding animals in the country, and then having the meat available domestically, versus having the animals fed and raised in other countries and then the meat imported to China. And China has made, for reasons I'll explain in a minute, the decision to do the latter, that is, to have the animals raised in other countries primarily and have the meat imported into the country. Think for a moment about why they might have chosen to do that. But it's an enormously important trade decision. The trade partners that are most important in this picture with China are Brazil, Argentina, and the United States. And you may have guessed now why China decided to do this. They have, in that one trade decision, made it much easier for that country to meet its environmental goals, because the environmental cost of raising the meat the water problems, antibiotic resistance, and above all, climate change contributions from the meat consumption are being borne by those other countries, and China doesn't have to pay for them, so they have externalized those things. So these are very important decisions that are occurring on the world scene that affect what goes on in our field, and as I started to learn more about this, I learned a lot. My interest in delving into this came about from really two things that occurred a number of years ago when I was at Yale University. First, I was teaching a class to undergraduates on food policy, and of course I had to deliver more information than just obesity policy. And so I learned a lot more about food and agriculture and how these systems began to fit together, which was instructive for me. And then also at the same time, Yale began a sustainable food program. And the farm happened to be not too far from where my offices were, and we let the people who were directing this sustainable farm have office space in our building. So I got to meet them and learn a lot more about that world. And it occurred to me then that my own education was deficient and that I needed to know more about these other areas. As I set out to explore these other areas, I found that those people didn't know what was going on in our field. And just like any field of endeavor, people are working in segmented areas and tend not to interact with one another. And I think that problem could be solved if we were able to work together more effectively. So the consequence of this is that we have established a World Food Policy Center at Duke University that launched only 6 or 7 months ago, so it's relatively new. But the idea behind this center, instead of recreating depth on any one topic, like obesity or food insecurity, it's meant to be a bridge across topics. That's its main function. And we don't find many examples of this around the world. We think it could be daunting because the purview is so broad, but exciting at the same time. And let me explain why we believe this is important. So if we look at world food issues, you can cluster these issues in many different ways. I'm going to talk about 4 categories of world food problems that we are setting out to bridge. One could have 2 or 10 or 20 categories, but 4 is arbitrary, but helpful and we think intuitive. And so the 4 categories are these, and they're fairly intuitive. So one cluster of issues pertains to hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition. The second, obesity, overnutrition, and chronic disease. The third is a very large category of agriculture and environment. And one can talk about within that area about biodiversity, genetically modified foods, the impact of agriculture on environment and the reverse, water issues and the like. And the final area is food safety and food defense issues. And it was our hypothesis that these areas weren't collaborating very much. And we received some money to test that hypothesis, and we found that it was correct. And we find then that the world food policy picture is a conglomeration of inputs from all these different areas. But these areas, because they're not coordinating very well or collaborating, the policy picture isn't nearly as coordinated as it might be or having nearly the impact that it might. So we are setting out to correct that by creating the bridge that I just discussed. So let me go into each of these areas in just a little detail. First, I'd like to describe the results of a paper that was published in The Lancet in 2015 that looked at the leading risk factors for disease in country after country around the world. And the leading risk factors for disease are these in terms of explaining global deaths. And as you look down the list, it's interesting how often food is implicated here. And in nearly every case, food is a very important player in places like you'd expect, like with weight, with undernutrition, with high blood pressure and the like, high blood sugar, but also in interesting things like outdoor air pollution, because creating food creates a lot of outdoor air pollution. Indoor air pollution, which shows up as a leading risk factor. Much of that is caused by inefficient use of cook stoves in developing countries, creating high rates of asthma and other chronic diseases. So getting food right is a very important priority for the world. It's very hard to get food right now. The question is, can we continue to get food right as we go forward with strains on the world because of population increases? So let's talk about the first cluster of problems, food insecurity, malnutrition, and hunger, and try to get a scope of the size of this problem. So in 2015, the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, published this report saying that 795 million people are chronically undernourished. Massive, massive numbers of people, which is a tragedy given that the world now creates enough food to feed all these people. So the hunger and malnutrition are economic and political problems rather than production problems. That may change, but for now that's the case. Now these numbers are massive, but of course the human toll of these numbers is stunning. So one can think about how a malnourished child is at risk for any number of diseases, how that child cannot learn in school because of being malnourished, how the family then can't function as those children grow and others depend on that individual, and how national economies are affected by this. We know that refugee populations are often caused by food shortages and the political strife that that causes between countries. So the cost of this problem is enormous. If we look at expected population growth going out to 2050, this is an enormous strain that will be placed on world agriculture resources. And there are very real questions about whether the world can produce enough food to feed all those people. In order to answer yes to that question, can we feed all those people, we have to have tremendous faith in technology. And the technology itself comes with a cost. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. And we can ask, can this possibly be done? And here's a very interesting figure that gives you a sense of the scope. So can the world afford to do this? Now there is some good news with this data, that over the years, going back to the early 1990s, the prevalence of people who are undernourished in the world has been going down. So there have been major successes, pushed a lot by important philanthropies around the world, national governments, agriculture technology, the most recent generations of work on the Green Revolution, et cetera. So this is a positive development, although the absolute numbers of people affected are still quite high. But then in 2017, the FAO published this report and said that after all those years of downward trending numbers in terms of food insecurity, the number of chronically undernourished people in the world is estimated to have increased to 815 million, up from the previous number in 2015. So the progress that was being made seems to have been reversed, at least temporarily. And this report says that these changes are exacerbated by climate-related shocks, conflicts, seriously affect food security, and are a cause of much of the recent increase in food insecurity. So we get a sense here about political conflicts and climate interacting with one another to affect food. And food in turn, availability of food, affects those things. And so we have this interesting back and forth between very important issues. Okay, so going on to obesity. So I won't talk about this issue very much, given that the audience knows a great deal about the topic. But I will report some information from this paper published in The Lancet in 2016 that looked at rates of obesity around the world, and they concluded that if the trends continue, the probability of meeting the global obesity target is virtually zero. So there's a lot of room to make progress on the obesity problem as well.